Hi everyone, today we are going to be looking at the classic research for the positive approach. So this was conducted by Myers and Diener. So we're going to look at their investigation today and see what they found. So first of all, we need to have a think about the aim of the study. So the aim of the study was to see what kind of people are happy. Sorry about my horrible handwriting there. So they wanted to know what traits happy people possessed. Because they were looking at the traits that people have, it means that they had no IV or DV. So there was no independent variable or dependent variable. So that means that there was actually no hypothesis within the study, as they were not actually collecting their own data. There was no primary data involved in this study. So we're going to look at that in a bit more depth. So the research method that they used was a lit review and a meta-analysis. So first of all, we need to actually know what a lit review and a meta-analysis is before we go any deeper. So a literature review is an article which includes both any current knowledge on a topic as well as findings and conclusions and theories from past research. So this is from someone else's work. And then a meta-analysis is when data from several past studies are analysed in order to draw new conclusions. So basically they were looking at past research collected by other people. So this means that they were secondary sources of data which they found using these methods. So there were interviews, questionnaires, observations, correlational studies and other meta-analyses. So like we said, they did not conduct their own research, meaning that they had no original experimental work to report on. So they were looking at the issue of happiness through interviews, questionnaires, observation, correlations and meta-analyses. So now the participants, we need to think about who was actually in this study. So for this study, we would classify it as them having none because they were working on past research. They didn't actually conduct their own research, meaning there were no participants. So there was a large sample of participants who were used in their secondary data, though it was not their actual participants in their study because it wasn't their research. So you might be wondering, why did Myers and Diener actually use secondary sources with large sample sizes in their lit review rather than using their own research? So this was to allow them to investigate various factors that may affect happiness. So these are things such as age, genders, faith, money, wealth, and culture. So by having no participants but working and drawing on other people's work, it meant that they could focus on these things. So therefore, how did Myers and Diener go about obtaining the sample for their literature review? Well, they did not sample any of their own participants, but rather used the secondary data with large sample sizes. So there are other studies which have also done this in a range of different topics, and Myers and Diener felt that this would be the best way to find the answers to their question. So this meant that Myers and Diener didn't actually control anything within their study, and it also meant that they didn't have to worry about any extraneous variables or confounding variables because they wouldn't have come up in their study because nothing was being manipulated. So you might be asking yourself, what is the benefit of using these secondary sources within this study? So it ensured that Myers and Diener were actually dealing with and subsequently drew the conclusion that they did in the end had high validity and reliability because of this. So due to the nature of this study, technically there was no procedure within this study as they did not collect their own research. They were just looking at prior research. So they chose the topic of happiness to investigate, and they decided to scope the literature review in terms of 9 different factors, which we're going to look at now. So the factors that they focused on was faith, flow, relationships, traits, age, gender, wealth, culture, and race. So we know that flow is something really important within the positive approach. So this is obviously a key point of interest within this study. So they selected the database that they would use to conduct the search of secondary sources of data, and they conducted their searches and found the literature which was the secondary sources of data regarding happiness. So they reviewed the literature and conducted their meta-analyses in order to draw their own conclusions. So to be able to look into these things, they had to sample participants' behaviour. So they did this by using beepers so that they could send the messages which states instructions of asking them to point out how they're feeling at certain points in time. So that's a clock. So in order to measure the participants' subjective well-being is typically abbreviated to this. Participants were asked a range of closed questions, which, for example, were how satisfied have you been with your life recently? So this would go from very satisfied all the way down to fairly satisfied and so on. So this was on a scale. So you would go from very to fairly to somewhat to not at all and so on. So Myers and Diener were looking for factors that varied with happiness. So they assess whether such factors contribute to people's happiness or it's a consequence of their happiness. So overall, the 4 factors that they noted were of importance were faith, flow, relationships, and traits. So they found that religious people were more likely to express greater levels of happiness than those who are not religious. They also noted that the more satisfied one is with their job, the happier they are because work provides an individual with a sense of community and what matters in life. Also that they are able to engage in a sense of flow throughout their work life. So what further evidence was there to support the influence of work and flow on happy people from Myers and Diener's Lit Review? So it was found that work that was unsatisfying or was very stressful in its nature had been associated with happiness levels. So the less enjoyable your work was, the less flow, the less happiness that you would feel from that. So one element that is part of this theory of happiness is the importance to adapt due to the tendency of the effects of positive and negative events that fade throughout our lifetimes. So we need to be able to adapt to certain situations. So if something bad happens, we will not always be in a state of unhappiness. This over time will change to us being complacent sometimes happy, sometimes angry, and sometimes really super duper happy. So we need to be able to adapt as well as having these things within our lives. They also found variables such as wealth and physical health and so on had a minimal long-term influence on subjective well-being, despite the opposite being presumed for such a long time. So, for example, those who have won the lottery have experienced a short-term increase in happiness, but those who have survived horrific experiences such as assault or the Holocaust and so on tend to overcome the psychological trauma. So this really backs up the point of being able to adapt. So their findings really showed that the human ability to adapt to life circumstances means that our happiness will vary over time. So this is supported by longitudinal studies that found that only last 3 months of one's life will affect your subjective well-being. So these other factors have to come into play here. So happiness is relative to one's capacity to adapt to their life circumstances rather than variables such as their wealth or health. And another element that is part of this theory of happiness is culture around the world. So cultural attitudes tend to predispose different groups of people to interpret life events differently. For example, some cultures view the world as being benevolent and controllable, whilst other cultures may not. So having different cultural templates for interpreting life events serves as predisposing variables to subjective well-being. So now that we know all of that, we need to unpick the actual study itself. So it had low internal validity due to social desirability bias. So when participants provide favourable answers that coincide with the social norms, it may not actually reflect their own views. So we've got to bear that in mind. So how did social desirability bias impact on this? So it meant that it was difficult for Myers and Diener to accurately distinguish whether there was a link between happiness and certain situations that we may find ourselves in, such as age and so on. So this shows that it was low in internal validity, as this is a weakness of this study. So by using the data that originated from self-report techniques, there was a chance of social desirability bias that had occurred, which would have made it difficult to establish the relationships they were trying to look for. Though one strength of this is that it is high in population, and that means that there is good external validity, because there was such a large group of people. So there was a very large group of participants, because it had quite a lot of bits of data used throughout this study. So what did I mean by population validity? So this is whether one's measures were accurate enough for it to be generalised to the whole population. So this study, unfortunately, was low in internal validity due to the research bias as well as social desirability bias. So Myers and Diener might have been looking for what they were predicting to find. So if they thought that maybe a baby was going to be happier than an old man, they may be looking for that kind of stuff. So that would mean that whatever they were looking at, they would always see the babies as being the happy ones and the old people being the sad ones. So if you're looking for these trends, you're going to find them. And as they were looking at previous research, it meant that they were able to look for exactly what they wanted to find. So this means that it's got low validity due to this issue. So what do I mean by research bias? So this is when the researcher already has an idea of their findings and conclusions are going to be already, which leads them to look for the clues that they had in mind. So now we need to think of what evidence is there to support Myers and Diener's methods and procedures, findings, conclusions, that there was an effect on research bias. So it is unlikely that Myers and Diener did not actually include or reference all the available research. So there's no way of knowing if they included everything. So we can't determine if everything was included in this study. So overall, this would mean that they had been selective when including some studies that didn't include others, and most of the evidence of which being the preference of the researcher conducted in Western countries such as the USA. So how does the fact that not all available research on happiness was not included in this study? So it means the findings and conclusions that Myers and Diener would have attempted to subsequently draw from their literature review would be inaccurate, and as they would not be able to have the holistic view of happiness due to the selective inclusion of some research over others. So this serves in reducing the internal validity in their research. And therefore, why was there any effect on researcher bias as a weakness of Myers and Diener's methods, procedures, and so on? So by not including this available research in happiness, it's likely that Myers and Diener did only select the research that they wanted for their actual conclusions. So the overall trait of happy people that they found within this study was high self-esteem, a sense of personal control, optimism, and being outgoing, so extroversion. So the relationships with people is also something to consider. So for some people, relationships create more stress and unhappiness than happiness. So for most people, the benefits outweigh the strains, and research shows that people can name several close friends tend to be healthier than people who don't have close friends. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're in a romantic relationship. It can be any relationship. So relationships were really important. Okay, and then next is flow. So the workplace and flow of happy people. So work satisfaction affects happiness, and people who are out of work are less happy than those who are in work. So work provides a personal sense of identity and a sense of one's life mattering, and also a sense of community as well. So there's quite a few different threads when we consider flow and work. So, however, work can also be unsatisfying and stressful, and it can be associated with unhappiness, just like relationships can. So interviewing people using closed questions is used to assess a person's subjective well-being. Alternatively, a multi-item scale, which can include a number of questions related to happiness. So another way to discover what people are doing is by asking them to report what they are doing at a selected time. So this is when they used beepers. So the use of beepers can be used to remind participants to send a message saying what they're doing or thinking at a particular moment. So another way to understand happiness is to consider what factors co-vary with it. So some of these factors can contribute to making a person happy, whereas factors are consequences of being happy. So it is not always clear what causes this cause and effect kind of relationship. So this study is a review of research, and some of the research referred to within it is from multiple studies. So the overall findings of age we're going to chat about now. So the survey is of almost this many people. So that's a lot of people from all different ages, from 16 different countries around the world. And they found no difference in age. So there wasn't actually a difference in age overall. So people of all ages were equally happy, meaning that there was a mean score of 80% overall of satisfaction. So, however, at different ages, different factors do contribute to happiness. So then happiness and gender. So Inglehart's survey of people in 16 different countries found that 80% of men and 80% of females said that they were fairly satisfied with life. However, research has also found that women are twice as vulnerable as men to depression. So this is interesting because this study was conducted in 1995, and we now have different statistics on age. So I wonder if there's going to be a difference in women being more subjected to states of depression than males now. Okay, so race and culture now. So people in individual countries reported greater subjective well-being than in collectivist countries. So In an individualist culture, people are more concerned with their individual needs, whereas collectivist cultures, people focus on the needs of the group that they're in. And finally, is happiness related to money? So people who are rich do not report greater happiness, and a survey found with people on the Forbes rich list found that 37% were actually less happy than the average American. So on the other hand, we need to think of the lack of importance of money does not apply to situations where people are poor. So if you're living in a country where you're really deprived of money, the increase in cash will impact on your increase in happiness. Though if you're living in a country such as the UK, where we tend to be quite a wealthy country, happiness will not increase or decrease with a huge boost of money overall, unless it's just for that short period of time that we spoke about earlier. So that's just a really quick whistle-stop tour of this study, and we're going to look at it in a bit more depth in the lesson going forward. So hopefully that gives you a good indication of the fundamental aspects of Myers and Diener's study.